Well, it's that time of year again. Time to explore new lands and kill off whatever's minding its own business while framing it as an act of heroics. What can I say, it's a part of my culture. Every time I go to put down Monster Hunter, it's always, I'll just play one more. I've got time for another. A quick hunt, why not? I mean, I always manage to pull myself away eventually and go pet the dogs. Just one more. Still, it lifted me out of my classic seasonal depression. At least, it did up until the point it gave me stick drift, so balance has unfortunately been restored. It's undoubtedly addictive, but unlike the majority of addictive digital sinkholes, this one's actually quite good. But what's actually good about it? I hear nobody ask, but for the sake of the video, if you could just play along, that'd be grand. It's the combat. With a game called Monster Hunter, that might not be a shocking revelation, but you wouldn't think that had you just booted up Monster Hunter for the first time. And back in 3U, I was under the assumption that this action RPG was a lot more of the latter than the former. Not only because it's core to the motivation loop of the game, but also because occasionally combat just stopped being good. I wonder what could have caused that? Killing monsters will give you materials specific to that monster, which allows you to make new weapons, which makes it easier to kill larger monsters. Early on in the game, progress allows for more progress, like some kind of Katamari, but with a big sword. You get drawn to a big new sword, and that anticipation helps to keep you playing, but by the time that falls away and improvements become choices of preference rather than objective upgrades, you'll probably have found a flow that you've either fallen in love with or stopped playing long before that. Fighting new monsters can only carry so much of the gameplay weight. It's easy to get lost in the grandeur of fighting a giant European folklore creature or a big fish. But the novelty that spectacle provides is just that, a novelty. And while a combination of animation and AI helps you forget that they're effectively a big cube with a bunch of variables stored inside of it, it's the three mechanical pillars of combat that helps to keep every cube fun whilst also keeping them varied. Them three pillars being the monster's impact, your weapon objectives, and the monster objectives. Combat goes like this: the creature is minding its own business until you come to liberate them. You'll beat the monster to a pulp in different ways depending on your weapon, ranging from juggling file buildups, ensuring you don't lock yourself out, managing 2 separate timers, and using 2 different weapons in sync with each other, to that really big move? Yeah, that's your job. Regardless of what weapon you're playing, everyone shares the reality that the monster is primarily in control of the fight. That's because while the monster can toss you around like a dog toy, you have to slowly build towards any knockdowns with the assistance of part breaks. This puts the player in what is effectively the defender's role. For the large portion of the fight, you're going to be responding to the monster. Perhaps not directly cowering in fear, but at least changing your actions in response to what the monster is doing. Oh, Leon, of course you change your actions depending on the enemy's attacks. It's a video game. If you've ever wanted to have the illusion of combat fall away, think about the combat as you play Skyrim. Swinging swords, firing fire, Hatsune Miku, it's all here. But it's all a lie. What frames itself as tense combat might as well be an introductory class to approximate mathematics when the only important element to combat is whether or not you can go, oh, well, I make small numbers, and that one, I'm pretty sure it was big. That one's also quite big, but it's nothing an old can of Stella can't solve, eh? Whenever you or the opponent throw out an attack, nothing actually changes in the world. You put a big axe in his ribcage like butter, and he does the exact same to you. The game doesn't do anything to establish who's in control of the situation, because the only factor in combat that actually matters is who can throw out the bigger number. That's not engaging, that's preschool maths wrapped up in medieval aesthetics. It's not necessarily awful within the larger context of the game. After all, Skyrim places more emphasis on the RPG and exploration elements of its gameplay, but that doesn't mean that it's engaging combat. You like fighting in Skyrim because of the shit that it leads you to, not because of its riveting basic subtraction. Monster Hunter does a lot more to establish who's in control. When the monster can fling you away at any time, but you can't, you have to identify a position of power within the fight. It forces you to look at the situation and identify what options cause what outcomes. Not only when the attack is coming towards you and you need to recognize which way to dodge or if you can challenge the moves more directly, but also when you should stop attacking, because it's causing you to commit for so long that you don't have an option to back out. It creates an essential layer to a fight that actively encourages you to participate with the game through every single attack, regardless of how big or small the change to your health bar is. Some of you might be on the brink of the phrase "so like Souls games," and you should probably be careful, rocks are about to come through your window, since both sides of the fandom are pretty sick of a comparison that only works perks on the surface. They might share the same consequences when hit, as well as sharing how you avoid damage, but the way that it interacts with the rest of the player's actions is entirely different. Souls titles focus heavily on stamina management and make the weapon's variations on attack speed, hitbox length, and stamina use. Fights are immensely tense, not only because most hits put you right next to death, but also because every offensive choice has knock-on effects on how readily you can access your defensive choices. The player wants to use their stamina to be offensive, and the enemy wants to force that resource to be defensive. And this tug of war is what makes combat engaging and satisfying to get really good at. Or you could just play pyromancies, you child. How dare you not like this game the way I do? That's a massive oversimplification of the combat, but the important part is that the player's balance for a resource is directly impeded and used against them by the enemies, which is not found in Monster Hunter, along with a couple other differences. Jesus, alright, I won't mention souls anymore, fucking hell. Monster Hunter has an alternative conflict, where the monster is attempting to interject with the goal that you have as a weapon user. This is where attempting to analyze Monster Hunter starts to get really messy, because depending on what weapon you're using, you're going to view this element of the game very differently. A lot of the weapons that came from Monster Hunter's conception are more focused around hitting specific types of moves, and finding opportunities to land attacks that aren't always going to be the best option, but would be the ideal one. The greatsword, the hammer, the modern lance, they all have attacks that are objectively more powerful than most in their kit, but require more of an opening than the monster will normally provide. As time goes on though, there's been more of a trend towards having weapons involve more elements of management. Build up this bar to gain access to a move that gives you another bar to manage. This weapon uses shells and resources that need to be reloaded, and only certain moves can be accessed from this specific resource. Fill this bar to get laughed at by your peers. There's now many more types of objectives that the player wants to meet with their weapon, but they're all connected by the monster's independent actions attempting to stop you from getting there. You've still got the conflict of interest between the two parties, but it isn't as strong as something like, Bloodborne? The monster is still influencing your weapon goals, but in the same way that me placing this ad will influence your viewing retention. You know, it was a roadblock that stopped you from getting where you wanted to go. This causes fights to be very anticipation orientated, not only anticipating attacks, but also building towards your desired goals and always looking for ways to speed up that process. You're still placed in the defender's role providing tension, but you're given a task as a weapon user that requires you to maintain some kind of offense. It's the conflict of your weapon encouraging you to be offensive and the consequences of failure encouraging you to be defensive that defines the game's tug of war, making long strings of success intensely gratifying as you know how quickly it can be taken away from you. Keep it going for long enough and eventually they topple over and suddenly the tables have turned. This part right here, this completes Monster Hunter. The persistence of the player allowing the game to flip from playing the defensive and responsive role to being in the primary position of power and given unchallenged freedom to meet your weapon goals is a gratification that I don't think can be found in almost any other game. The monster is always threatening your ability to achieve your weapon goals, but for each small success, you work towards objectives related to the monster, which helps to flip the switch on the fight for a while. Knockdowns, part breaks, stuns, they're all essential beats in a fight that justify them taking 7 to 20 minutes. It's not enough that we kill the Rathian, break every single bone in her body and cut her tail off. Doesn't matter if we cart 3 times, so long as she's weak enough for the brute hairs to finish her. This melding of elements, and more importantly the interactions between them, is at the core of what makes Monster Hunter work. If you remove weapon goals, the game would just become Rajang sitting you down the field and demanding that you play his special version of Patty Cake. Without the monster's impact, you'd have Skyrim, but slightly better, and without the monster's objectives, you'd have a 10-minute grind fest. So as you might be able to tell, it's a pretty tight-knit game, with a very specific idea of fun where very minute changes can drastically ruin the balance of systems at play. Anyway, here's 3 other players to take aggro for you, and every weapon play is entirely different. Have fun spending 10 hours figuring out if you don't like the weapon or you just don't like it against the big fish that spends most of the fight underwater. Oh, wasn't Monster Hunter so much better when you didn't bring the right items so the pace of the fight was fucked? Most games with such a focused loop would probably try to stick to that pretty tightly, but Monster Hunter's not afraid to put a bullet through its own idea of fun and then pass you the gun, unfortunately. Honestly, if you main either of the guns, you should find the time to find out what the end of the barrel tastes like. I'm getting sidetracked. Monster Hunter might not seem like a game with a whole lot of player freedom and expression, which is kinda true. but there's a lot of flexibility in how you can experience the core. You might still be word 1, word 2ing, but you can push down different aspects or increase them to your liking. Once you get over your crippling social anxiety, you could play with more players and reduce the amount of aggro that you have to deal with and lessen the tension that the monster provides. Fucking hate people? And animals? Turn them all off and make turning this one off even more intense. If you want to more frequently enjoy that flip from defensive to offensive, you can play Hammer, where one of the key objectives is to hit the head, which grants you a stun on top of normal knockdowns. Scared of people thinking you're too dumb to play other weapons? Every weapon has a variant that allows you to run paralysis or sleep. Play that, and we'll all just pretend that you aren't a walking lobotomite. Want less to manage? Play these. Want more to manage? Play these. Want to keep all of the elements the same but see every single action that takes place as an opportunity? Play this. You know, it's not exactly fucking silly putty, but it is a very moldable experience that allows you to pick and choose the elements that you want to play into the most. Still though, surely adding 3 other people completely dissolves any sense of urgency to a fight. You might not be wrong in that assumption. Having 3 other people to take aggro does spread enough of the tension to the point where it's rarely felt, but it's still a good time even if it is a bit brain AFK. You don't even really need to communicate with each other. You end up coordinating naturally thanks to how the different weapon goals all end up melding together. If the Hammer player's goal is to get them stuns going by hitting the head, and the Longsword's goal is to manage their meter and cut the tail, they'll end up working together like star-crossed lovers even if they can't talk, but with a big dragon between them. Every time the Hammer player gets a stun, the Sword gets to go for the tail, and all the time that the Sword player is managing their meter, they're building towards a knockdown, which gives both of them an opening to their goal. Cut the tail, and the Hammer then gets a free opening of their own. Each individual success helps to lead to somebody else's, even if that was never in the player's intentions. Does that sound like fun? No? Then fuck off. Dynamic balance means that all the content can be beaten solo, it's just more on you when you're getting ballsed on by Apex Rathalos. It's not like that other action RPG where the combat and tension is so deeply intertwined that doing bosses co-op almost actively detracts from the experience. When people talk about Monster Hunter and what they like about it, it often comes across as a bit vague. Fight big monster, good. Alright, grand, but like, are we out here waiting around for the big glowing eye to open up? What exactly does that mean? I think the answer ends up being so vague because it's hard to pin down the exact reason everyone's able to play Monster Hunter and enjoy it when everyone's playing nearly entirely different games. I love Monster Hunter, and they love Monster Hunter. But role swap us and I'll ask you to go outside and check your mailbox. The weapon you choose creates very different ways that you approach problems compared to your friends, and so it's incredibly difficult to isolate a small set of mechanics that make Monster Hunter appealing. And what the player enjoys about combat is going to change based on the perspective that the weapon makes them take, as well as their preferences as a person. Or at least, I think it does, and the 14 pages of script that I've thrown away is all the evidence I can muster. What I think makes Monster Hunter good, beyond just the aesthetics and the concept of I can kill Godzilla with this small sword, is the interactions and flow between power dynamics caused by the different combat pillars that every player shares, and the player's ability to amplify and de-emphasize what they choose. But maybe that's just me. But at least we can all agree it isn't fucking egg quests. Oh, I like them, they make the world more realised. No, you fucking don't. Oh, the Jaggies are looking at me strange, and so the egg exploded. You know what, fine, here's the controller. Don't worry, it's not the one with stick drift. I bought a new one, even though I don't really have the money for it. Go on, play it, go on. Right now, I'm watching. Oh, big surprise. You're not playing. You know why? It's because it's shit.